The fire started at 2:47 a.m. on November 3, 1952, in a storage facility in Culver City that housed MGM's archive of sensitive materials. By the time firefighters arrived, the entire building was engulfed. Official reports listed the cause as electrical malfunction, but the night watchman told a different story to his daughter years later. Two men in suits arrived 30 minutes before the fire, carrying briefcases and wearing gloves despite the mild November weather. They left 14 minutes later. The building was burning before their car turned the corner. Among the items destroyed that night were personnel files, financial ledgers, and a collection of photographs that studio executives had been keeping locked in a vault since 1937. One photograph in particular, according to a secretary who'd seen it years earlier, showed Jean Harlow standing in what appeared to be a doctor's examination room, her face bruised, her expression hollow. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in pencil, "Blue Room, March 1935, never to be released, never to be discussed." The secretary remembered asking her supervisor what the Blue Room was. The supervisor's answer was immediate. "You never heard that name, understand?" MGM wasn't just a movie studio. It was a containment system disguised as a dream factory. Every major studio had one, a private medical facility hidden somewhere on the lot, staffed by doctors whose primary loyalty was to the corporation, not the Hippocratic Oath. At MGM, this facility was known internally as the Blue Room. The name came from the wall color, a pale, institutional blue that was supposed to be calming, but instead felt like drowning. It was located in the basement of the administration building, accessible only through a private elevator that required a key held by three people: Louis B. Mayer, his head of security, and the chief studio physician, Dr. Edward Jones. The Blue Room's official purpose was to provide confidential medical care for contract players who needed treatment for conditions that might damage their public image. Venereal diseases, alcoholism, drug addiction, pregnancy, anything that could generate scandal was handled in the Blue Room, away from public hospitals and prying journalists. But according to testimonies that emerged decades later from former studio employees, the Blue Room served another purpose: behavior modification through medical intervention. Actresses who were deemed difficult, who missed rehearsals, complained about working conditions, or refused roles would be required to undergo medical evaluations in the Blue Room. These evaluations often resulted in mandatory treatments: hormones to regulate mood, sedatives to reduce anxiety, amphetamines to increase energy and compliance. Jean Harlow's name appeared in the Blue Room's appointment log 47 times between 1933 and 1937. We know this because a junior accountant named Ruth Morrison kept a duplicate set of records for insurance purposes. When MGM tried to destroy those records in the 1952 fire, Ruth had already retired and taken her copies with her. She donated them to a film preservation society in 1981, a year before she died. The records don't specify what treatments Jean received. They just list dates, times, and a cryptic notation: standard protocol, patient compliant. Let's reconstruct what might have happened in March 1935, based on fragmented evidence and witness accounts that surfaced years after Jean's death. Jean was filming China Seas with Clark Gable. The production was troubled from the start: budget overruns, script problems, tension between the director and the cinematographer. Jean was exhausted. She'd completed 3 films in the previous 7 months and was showing signs of what we'd now recognize as burnout, insomnia, memory problems, emotional volatility. During the second week of March, Jean missed 2 days of shooting. The official explanation was influenza. But Jean's hairdresser, a woman named Beatrice Cole, later told a different story. She claimed Jean had arrived at the studio on March 11th with visible bruising on her arms and face. When Beatrice asked what happened, Jean said she'd fallen downstairs. But Beatrice didn't believe it. The bruises had a pattern, like fingers gripping too hard. The next day, Jean was summoned to Louis B. Mayer's office. Whatever was said in that meeting, Jean emerged looking terrified, according to Mayer's secretary. 2 hours later, Jean was taken to the Blue Room by studio security. She remained there for 6 hours. When she returned to set the following day, the bruises were gone, covered by heavy makeup, and her entire demeanor had changed. Beatrice described it as Jean being hollowed out, like someone had reached inside and removed something essential. Here's where documented fact ends and speculation begins. According to an unverified account from a nurse who allegedly worked in the Blue Room, Jean's March 1935 visit wasn't for medical treatment, it was for intimidation. The bruises on her face, they were from her husband at the time, cinematographer Harold Rawson, during a violent argument about Jean's refusal to continue taking the amphetamines the studio doctors were prescribing. Jean wanted to stop. She wanted to quit films, marry William Powell, live a quiet life away from the cameras and the chemicals and the constant performance. But her MGM contract didn't expire until 1938, and she was still the studio's most profitable female star. Letting her leave wasn't an option. So the Blue Room served a different function that day. According to this uncorroborated account, Dr. Jones showed Jean a file containing photographs of her in various states of undress from costume fittings and makeup tests. He explained that if she broke her contract or spoke publicly about the studio's medical practices, these photographs would be released to newspapers along with fabricated stories about her mental instability and drug addiction. The session lasted 6 hours. By the end, Jean had agreed to continue her contract, continue the medication regimen, and never speak about the Blue Room to anyone. The photograph that allegedly showed Jean in the Blue Room with bruises, that was Dr. Jones's insurance policy. Evidence that she'd been treated there, in case she ever tried to claim the bruises, came from the studio's intimidation rather than her own clumsiness. Jean wasn't the first actress to receive this treatment, and she wouldn't be the last. The Blue Room operated on a simple principle: control through dependency and fear. Get the performers addicted to the medications that kept them functional. Create psychological leverage through compromising documentation. Make it clear that resistance would result in career destruction or worse. Several other actresses from the MGM stable, names we still recognize today, later admitted to being treated in facilities similar to the Blue Room. One actress, speaking anonymously in a 1987 documentary, described it as medical gaslighting on an industrial scale. They'd give you drugs that made you sick, then tell you the sickness proved you needed more drugs. They'd photograph you at your worst moments, then threaten to show the world unless you cooperated. It was brilliantly evil. But Jean's case was particularly tragic because she understood exactly what was happening. Unlike some performers who genuinely believed the studio doctors were helping them, Jean knew she was being poisoned. She told William Powell in a letter dated August 1936, "They're killing me slowly, and I'm letting them because the alternative is being destroyed quickly. At least this way I get to keep working. At least I'm still Jean Harlow for a little while longer." Powell kept that letter for the rest of his life. It was found among his personal effects when he died in 1984, stored in a locked box along with other correspondence from Jean. He never showed it to anyone, never spoke about it publicly, but his silence was its own kind of testimony. John's last documented visit to the Blue Room was May 20, 1937, 18 days before her death. By this point, she was critically ill with kidney failure, though neither she nor her doctors fully understood how close to the end she was. According to Ruth Morrison's records, this appointment lasted 90 minutes, significantly longer than usual. The notation beside the entry reads, "Emergency consultation, protocol adjusted, discharge conditional." What does that mean? We can only speculate, but former Blue Room staff members have suggested that protocol adjusted was code for changing a patient's medication regimen, and discharge conditional meant the patient was being released with specific behavioral requirements. One theory, unproven but persistent, suggests that Jean went to the Blue Room that day to beg for help. She knew something was catastrophically wrong with her body. She was retaining fluid, experiencing severe headaches, struggling to remember her lines. She wanted real medical attention from doctors who weren't on the studio payroll. The response, according to this theory, was to increase her sedative dosage to keep her manageable and to threaten her with contract violations if she sought outside medical care. MGM had too much invested in completing Saratoga, her current film. They needed another 2 weeks of shooting. After that, Jean could see whatever doctors she wanted. She died before those 2 weeks elapsed. Saratoga was completed using a body double for the remaining scenes. The studio's investment was protected. Jean Harlow wasn't. Let's return to that 1952 fire. Why would someone burn MGM's sensitive archives 15 years after Jean's death? The official explanation, electrical malfunction, is convenient but unsatisfying. A more plausible theory involves timing. In 1952, the House Un-American Activities Committee was investigating communist influence in Hollywood. Studios were scrambling to protect themselves from any scandal that might give the committee ammunition. MGM, in particular, had a lot to hide, not about communism, but about how they'd treated their contract players during the Golden Age. If the Blue Room's records became public during Holrick hearings, it would have been catastrophic, not just embarrassing, but potentially criminal. Forced medication, coercive medical procedures, systematic abuse disguised as healthcare. These weren't just PR problems, they were felonies. So someone made a decision: burn it all, destroy the evidence, the people who'd been most egregiously victimized. Jean Harlow, others like her, were dead and couldn't testify. The survivors could be paid off or intimidated into silence. But the documents were permanent. They had to go. The night watchman who saw two men in suits? He was paid $500 to keep quiet, a fortune in 1952 money for a security guard making $40 a week. He kept quiet for 30 years, but on his deathbed, he told his daughter, "I let them burn the proof. I took the money and let them burn the proof that those girls were tortured." His daughter shared this story with a film historian in 2009. The historian tried to verify it, but by that point, everyone directly involved was dead. All that remained were fragments, Ruth Morrison's duplicate records, witness accounts filtered through decades of memory decay, and the knowledge that something terrible had happened in the Blue Room, something terrible enough to justify arson 15 years later. William Powell rarely discussed Jean after her death, but in 1968, during a private dinner with director George Cukor, he said something that Cukor later recorded in his personal diary. "Jean didn't die of kidney failure. She died of a broken spirit that happened to manifest as kidney failure. They broke her systematically, year after year, drug after drug, threat after threat. By the time her body gave out, there wasn't enough of her left to fight for." Cukor asked Powell why he'd never gone public with this. Powell's response: "Who would believe me? MGM had the best lawyers money could buy, and I was just an actor who happened to love someone they owned. I couldn't save her when she was alive. Destroying myself trying to expose them after she was dead wouldn't bring her back." This resignation, this sense that the studio system was too powerful to challenge, was common among Hollywood insiders. They knew what was happening. They knew performers were being exploited, medicated into compliance, sometimes dying from the very treatments that were supposed to keep them working. But speaking out meant career suicide, legal retaliation, or worse. So they stayed silent, and Jean Harlow became another cautionary tale that nobody was allowed to tell. Here's a question worth considering. What if Jean had escaped? What if, in 1935 or 1936, she'd broken her contract, paid whatever penalties MGM demanded, and walked away from Hollywood entirely? Would she have survived? Would her kidneys have recovered without the constant pharmaceutical assault? Would she have married William Powell, had children, lived into old age as Harley and Carpenter instead of dying at 26 as Jean Harlow? We'll never know. But the fact that we can't know, that she was never given the choice, is the real tragedy. Jean Harlow didn't die from kidney disease. She died from a system that treated human beings as disposable assets, that prioritized profit over survival, that built an empire on the corpses of people who'd believed Hollywood's promises. The Blue Room was just one mechanism in that system. There were others: the casting couch, the morality clauses, the publicity machines that manufactured both fame and scandal as needed. But the Blue Room was particularly insidious because it disguised abuse as care. It made victims complicit in their own destruction by framing medication as medicine and control as treatment. Jean knew this. Her letters to Powell make it clear she understood exactly what was being done to her. But understanding didn't equal escape. Sometimes the cage is so well constructed that seeing the bars changes nothing. Today, Jean Harlow is remembered as the original blonde bombshell, the platinum goddess who defined an era. Her films are studied in cinema classes. Her image appears on posters and postcards. She's been the subject of numerous biographies, documentaries, and academic papers. But how many of those remembrances mention the Blue Room? How many acknowledge that her death at 26 wasn't random tragedy, but the inevitable conclusion of systematic abuse? How many are willing to say that Hollywood killed Jean Harlow and then profited from her death? The answer: almost none. Because that narrative doesn't sell nostalgia. It doesn't fuel our collective fantasy about the glamour of old Hollywood. It forces us to confront the fact that the movies we love were made by a system that consumed human lives like coal in a furnace. The photograph that allegedly showed Jean's bruises, the one that was destroyed in the 1952 fire, that image, had it survived, would have made this reckoning unavoidable. It would have been proof, visual and undeniable, that Jean Harlow wasn't just a star who burned too bright. She was a victim who was never allowed to say so. So here's where we end, with questions that can't be fully answered because the evidence was deliberately destroyed and the witnesses are dead. Was the Blue Room everything the rumors suggest? Were Jean's medical treatments actually systematic poisoning disguised as health care? Did MGM burn their archives to hide criminal conduct? We have Ruth Morrison's records, fragmentary testimony from former employees, William Powell's private grief, and a photograph that no longer exists, described by a secretary who saw it once. We have patterns, other actresses with similar stories, other studios with similar facilities, other deaths that followed the same template of exhaustion and organ failure. What we don't have is the kind of evidence that would hold up in court or satisfy historians who demand absolute proof. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the genius of MGM's system was ensuring that when the machine broke people, it did so in ways that looked like natural causes, personal failings, or simple bad luck. Jean Harlow wanted to stop taking the pills that were killing her. The studio wouldn't let her. She died with her kidneys destroyed and her spirit exhausted. These facts are documented. The connection between them, the causality we can sense but can't quite prove, remains in that space between what happened and what can be said to have happened. But here's what I know. Somewhere in the ashes of that 1952 fire is the truth about Jean Harlow's final years. And the fact that someone burned it rather than let it survive tells us everything we need to know about whose version of history Hollywood wanted preserved. The Blue Room existed. Jean Harlow suffered there, and when she died, someone decided that secret was worth protecting at any cost, even arson, even complicity, even allowing her memory to be reduced to platinum hair and sex appeal, while the real story turned to smoke. What would Jean Harlow say if she could see how she's remembered? Would she recognize herself in the goddess we've made her? Or would she see only another performance, another erasure, another version of the lie she was forced to live until it killed her?